She took in 3 light-skinned children, and the whole town immediately decided it knew the truth. People whispered, pointed fingers, and talked behind her back, convinced she did it for money or attention. But when the real reason came out, the town fell silent, and many couldn't hold back their tears. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The town woke the way it always did, quietly and with a sense of certainty about itself. Morning light slid across the main street, touching the faded brick of the post office, the narrow windows of the diner, the gas station with its humming pumps, and the white wooden church that stood slightly apart, as if observing rather than participating. Nothing ever truly surprised this place. People believed they knew one another, believed that years of shared sidewalks and borrowed sugar had given them the right to conclusions. Doors opened at the same hour every morning. Coffee was poured into the same chipped mugs. Cars pulled into the same parking spots. Conversations began mid-thought, as though they had never ended the night before. In a town like this, routine was not just comfort. It was proof that the world was still under control. That was why they noticed her immediately. She appeared at the far end of the street, where the pavement narrowed and the houses grew older, walking slowly, as if each step required careful permission from her own body. She was a black woman, tall but slightly bent at the shoulders, her posture shaped by years of work and something heavier that could not be named so easily. Her coat was plain, practical, worn soft at the elbows. Her face held no trace of hurry, only a quiet determination that made people uneasy without knowing why. Beside her walked 3 children. They were light-skinned, unmistakably so, and the contrast struck the town before anything else did. It struck like a sound too loud for such an early hour. The oldest was a boy, perhaps 9 or 10, thin and rigid, his eyes moving constantly as if measuring distances, exits, risks. He walked half a step ahead of the others, his jaw set in a way no child should be. On the other side was a girl, 6 or 7, her hair pale and fine, tangled despite its careful braiding. She stayed close to the woman's leg, her fingers curled into the fabric of the coat, as though afraid it might vanish. The smallest was a boy barely out of toddlerhood, heavy with sleep, his head drooping, his hand clenched tightly in the woman's palm. They did not speak. That silence was the second thing the town noticed. The first pause happened at the diner. A spoon hovered above a bowl of oatmeal and never quite made it back down. The second pause followed at the gas station, where the cashier stopped counting change and simply stared. On the sidewalk, a woman tugged her own child a little closer without realizing she had done it. A man leaned back against a lamppost, squinting as if distance might explain what he was seeing. No one said anything out loud at first. This town did not rush its judgments. It savored them. Naomi Carter kept walking. She knew this street. She had known it long before it learned to look at her this way. She remembered it narrower, remembered the crack in the sidewalk near the church steps, remembered the maple tree that used to drop its leaves across the school fence every fall. Her feet turned instinctively at the corner, toward the older part of the town, and someone watching from a porch felt a small jolt of recognition. Wasn't she? The thought did not finish itself, but it lingered. Naomi felt the weight of the children through her hands, through the way they leaned into her without asking permission. She adjusted her grip on the smallest boy, lifting him just enough so his feet would not drag. His head rested against her shoulder now, warm and trusting in a way that hurt her chest if she thought about it too long. She did not look at the faces turned toward her. She did not meet the eyes that tried to catch hers. She had learned long ago that explanations offered too early were rarely believed. They reached the edge of town, where the houses leaned closer together and paint peeled quietly from their siding. Naomi stopped in front of a small home set back from the road, its porch low, its steps worn smooth by decades of use. The yard was tidy, though nothing about it was new. A few late flowers clung stubbornly to the soil. The windows were clean. The children hesitated. The oldest boy stopped just short of the steps. The girl tightened her grip. The smallest stirred, blinking awake, his free hand reaching blindly until it found Naomi's collar. She turned to them then, finally, her face softening in a way no one on the street could see. Her eyes were tired, yes, but steady. She crouched slightly so she could look at them properly, at their level, at the fear they tried so hard not to show. "You're home," she said quietly. "This is home." The words settled into the air, fragile as glass. The oldest boy searched her face, as if testing the strength of that promise. The girl swallowed, nodding once without understanding why. The youngest pressed his cheek deeper into her shoulder and sighed. Naomi opened the door. Behind them, the town began to breathe again. The diner door swung open. A car pulled away from the curb. Someone laughed too loudly, as though to erase the moment that had just passed. But the image remained, already changing shape as it traveled from mind to mind. A black woman, 3 white children, a house at the edge of town. By the time the door closed behind Naomi and the children, the story had already begun to write itself, and the town, confident as ever, believed it knew exactly how it would end. The town did not rush Naomi Carter's story, but it did not delay it either. By afternoon, it had found its rhythm, slipping into conversations as naturally as weather and prices and the small irritations of daily life. The image from the morning settled into people's minds and began to grow edges, details that had not been there before but felt true simply because they were repeated. At the grocery store, where aisles were narrow and voices carried, the woman at the register leaned closer to the next customer and lowered her voice in a way that made it louder. She had 3 of them, she said, shaking her head slowly, as if the motion itself explained everything. All white. "Did you see that?" The customer followed the shake of her head, lips pressed tight in a thoughtful line, already nodding before the sentence ended. Outside the school, parents gathered in loose clusters, pretending to scroll through their phones while watching one another. Someone mentioned the woman by name, though few were certain how they knew it. Naomi Carter. It sounded familiar enough to be correct. Someone else added that she must be fostering. Another said she had heard the state paid good money for that. A third, lowering her voice as though sharing concern rather than suspicion, wondered aloud if the children were safe. The words moved quickly, changing shape as they went, smoothing over doubt and sharpening certainty. No one spoke cruelly, not in their own minds. They framed their comments as questions, as worries, as reasonable observations. That was how judgment lived here, wrapped in courtesy and soft tones, never quite admitting what it was. Naomi felt it before she heard it. She felt it in the way conversations paused when she entered a room, in the way eyes slid away just a moment too late. She felt it in the careful politeness of strangers who had once been merely indifferent. Politeness, she knew, could be sharper than open hostility. She took the children to enroll them at school and daycare the next morning, holding a thick folder of documents against her chest. The building smelled of disinfectant and old paper. The secretary behind the desk smiled, but her smile did not reach her eyes. "You'll need to fill these out," the woman said, sliding a stack of forms across the counter, though Naomi had already handed her completed copies. The secretary glanced at the children again, her gaze lingering a second longer than necessary. "And we'll need to verify everything." Naomi nodded. She had expected this, she always did. The oldest boy, Daniel, stood rigid beside her, his shoulders squared as if bracing for impact. He watched the room, the doors, the people moving in and out, his eyes missing nothing. The girl, Lily, tucked herself closer into Naomi's side, her fingers twisting the hem of Naomi's sweater. The youngest, Marcus, squirmed, uneasy in the unfamiliar space, his lower lip trembling as he fought tears he did not understand. It took longer than it should have. Questions were repeated. Papers were checked and rechecked. Naomi answered calmly, her voice steady even when the same doubts circled back in different words. She had learned patience the hard way. When they finally left, the air outside felt heavier than it should have. Naomi bent down, smoothing Lily's hair, whispering reassurance she hoped would reach deeper than the fear. At home, behind the closed door, the children began to show what they had been holding in. Daniel paced the small living room, his movements sharp and controlled, stopping at the window every few minutes to peek through the curtain. Lily sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap, flinching at every sound from outside. Marcus cried when Naomi stepped into the kitchen, his small body stiffening with panic until she returned and scooped him up again. Naomi moved through the evening with practiced care. She cooked simple food, the kind that smelled familiar and warm. She set the table the same way she would every night, placing cups and plates with deliberate calm. Routine, she knew, was the first language of safety. Later, when the children were bathed and dressed in borrowed pajamas that were still a little too big, Naomi sat with them on the couch and read aloud from an old book she had found at a thrift store. Her voice was low and even, unhurried. Daniel listened without looking at the pages, his attention fixed on the sound of her breathing. Lily leaned against Naomi's arm, her eyes growing heavy. Marcus fell asleep halfway through, his fingers still curled into the fabric of Naomi's sleeve. When she carried them to bed, one by one, Naomi felt the weight of the day settle into her bones. She tucked blankets carefully around each small body, lingering just long enough to be certain their breathing had steadied. Daniel's eyes remained open until the last moment, watching her as if memorizing her shape. "Are you going to stay?" he asked quietly, his voice barely more than air. Naomi met his gaze. "I'm here," she said simply. "I'm not going anywhere." He nodded, accepting the answer not because he trusted it yet, but because he wanted to. Outside, the town continued its quiet assessment. A woman in the parking lot of the grocery store spoke a little louder than necessary when Naomi passed by, her words shaped to sound like concern. Someone at the gas station watched Naomi's hands as she paid, as though looking for something that would confirm the story already forming in his mind. One afternoon, as Naomi loaded groceries into her car, a stranger approached her with a careful smile. "It must be hard," the woman said, her tone heavy with implication, "taking on so much responsibility." Naomi paused, her fingers tightening around a paper bag. "It is," she replied, because the truth did not require defense. The woman nodded, satisfied, as if that single admission had proven something important. The children felt the tension in ways they could not name. Daniel stopped speaking unless spoken to. Lily began wetting the bed at night, her small body betraying her fear despite her efforts to be brave. Marcus clung to Naomi constantly, crying whenever she left the room, his trust fragile and absolute all at once. One evening, after the children were asleep, Naomi stood alone in the kitchen, the house quiet around her. She pressed her palms against the counter, breathing deeply, letting the exhaustion roll through her without knocking her down. She had expected the town's reaction. She had prepared for it. Still, there were moments when the weight of being watched, measured, and found lacking threatened to crack her resolve. She straightened, turning off the light, and moved toward the hallway. In the dimness, she paused outside the children's room, listening to the soft rise and fall of their breathing. The sound anchored her, reminded her why she had come back here, why she was willing to endure the unspoken judgment that clung to every interaction. The town believed it had seen enough to understand her. It believed the story was already written. But behind Naomi's quiet endurance, behind the closed doors and careful routines, there was a depth of history and sacrifice no one had yet imagined. And as the days passed, the silence between what was assumed and what was real began to stretch, thin and dangerous, waiting for the moment it would finally break. Inside the house, the town's voices could not enter directly, but their echo lingered in the walls, in the careful way Naomi closed the curtains each evening and checked the lock twice before going to bed. The house was small, older than most of the others on the street, with floors that creaked softly and a furnace that sighed before it warmed the rooms. It was not a house designed for children, not originally, but Naomi reshaped it quietly, patiently, with the precision of someone who understood how fragile safety could be. She began with the simplest things. Clean sheets, washed twice until the smell of detergent replaced the faint trace of whoever had slept in them before. A night light in the hallway, not too bright, not too dark, because complete darkness frightened Marcus and too much light made Daniel restless. Shoes lined neatly by the door, always in the same order, so Lily would not panic if she could not find hers. The house slowly learned their rhythms, the way a living thing might. Mornings started early. Naomi woke before the sun, moving through the kitchen with practiced silence. She packed lunches carefully, cutting sandwiches into neat halves, slipping fruit and small treats into the bags. She brewed coffee she barely drank, and oatmeal she insisted the children try, even when Daniel pushed it around his bowl suspiciously. She did not force them. She waited. She understood that trust, like appetite, returned in its own time. The children watched her constantly. Daniel watched with the vigilance of someone who had learned that adults were unpredictable. He noticed the way Naomi set her keys in the same bowl by the door every night, the way she folded towels the same way each time, the way she paused before answering questions that mattered. He filed these details away, as if building a map of her reliability. He spoke little, but when he did, his words carried the weight of careful selection. Lily watched with hope and fear tangled together. She followed Naomi from room to room when she could, offering help she did not yet know how to give. She asked questions that circled the same point without landing on it. What time was dinner? What day it was? Whether Naomi would be home when she got back from school. Naomi answered each one patiently, even when the repetition carved lines of fatigue into her face. Marcus watched with his whole body. He cried when Naomi stepped out of sight, his small hands clutching at her clothes as if she might dissolve if he let go. He startled at loud sounds, at the slam of a car door, at voices raised even in laughter. At night, he woke screaming, his cries sharp and desperate, until Naomi scooped him up and held him against her chest, rocking him slowly until his breathing matched hers. The house absorbed these moments. It held whispered reassurances and muffled sobs and long silences that spoke louder than words. Naomi worked within those silences, not trying to fill them too quickly. She set rules, but gently. Shoes off at the door, hands washed before meals, bedtime at the same hour every night. She explained each rule not as a command, but as a promise. This is how things are done here. This is how we stay safe. This is how tomorrow becomes predictable. The first real fracture appeared one evening when Daniel hid food under his mattress. Naomi found it by accident while changing the sheets. Crackers wrapped carefully in a napkin, a bruised apple, half a sandwich, the bread already stale. Her hands stilled as she looked at the small hoard, her chest tightening with a pain that was both familiar and unbearable. She did not confront him immediately. She replaced the items exactly as she had found them and finished making the bed. At dinner, she watched Daniel closely, noticed the way his eyes flicked to the kitchen cabinets, the way his shoulders tensed when Marcus dropped a spoon too loudly. Later that night, she sat on the edge of his bed. "You don't have to hide food here," she said softly. Daniel froze, his eyes snapping open. For a moment, his face hardened, every line of it braced for punishment. Then something cracked. His jaw trembled, his breath stuttered. "I was just in case," he whispered. Naomi nodded, her voice steady though her heart was breaking. "I know," she said, "but here, there's always more, even if you can't see it yet." He did not answer, but he did not pull away when she tucked the blanket around him. Lily's fear surfaced differently. She flinched when men spoke loudly, even on television. She froze when Naomi raised her voice even slightly, her eyes filling with tears she tried desperately to hold back. One afternoon, a delivery truck backfired in the street, and Lily dropped to the ground, covering her head with her arms. Naomi knelt beside her, ignoring the curious looks from the neighbors' windows, and held her until the shaking stopped. Marcus's trauma lived in his sleep. He woke screaming most nights, his small body rigid with terror, his cries tearing through the quiet house. Naomi learned to sleep lightly, one ear always tuned to his breathing. She learned the exact pressure of her hand on his back that calmed him, the rhythm of rocking that soothed him fastest. She whispered the same words each time, soft and low, until they seemed to weave themselves into his dreams. During the day, Naomi worked. She took shifts cleaning offices early in the morning and waited tables in the evening when she could find someone to watch the children. She stretched every dollar carefully, calculating groceries, utilities, school supplies. Exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, but she did not let it touch the children if she could help it. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was finally still, Naomi sat alone at the kitchen table. She spread papers in front of her, documents stamped with seals from different states, letters from offices that had taken months to respond. She read and reread them, as if by memorizing their words she could hold the future steady. She rarely cried. Tears felt dangerous, like they might open a door she did not have time to walk through. Instead, she breathed deeply and reminded herself that she had known this would be hard. That difficulty was not evidence of failure. Slow changes began to appear. Daniel started speaking in full sentences, his voice gaining a hint of its natural cadence. He asked cautious questions about school, about homework, about whether he could join the soccer team, even though he had never played before. Naomi said yes without hesitation. Lily laughed one evening at something Marcus did, a small sound at first, surprised by its own existence. She began to draw pictures and leave them on the kitchen table for Naomi to find. Stick figures holding hands. A house with light in the windows. Marcus slept through the night for the first time after 3 weeks. Naomi woke in panic when she realized the house was quiet, then stood in the doorway watching his chest rise and fall, relief washing over her in a silent wave. Outside, the town continued to watch. People noticed the children walking to school with Naomi each morning, noticed their clothes were clean, their lunches packed. They noticed Daniel's careful politeness, Lily's shyness, Marcus's wide-eyed curiosity. Some began to feel the first uncomfortable stirrings of doubt, though few acknowledged it openly. One afternoon, Naomi met the gaze of a woman across the street, someone who had spoken about her in whispers only days before. The woman looked away quickly, then back again, uncertainty flickering across her face. That night, as Naomi tucked the children into bed, Daniel spoke again in the dark. "Are we staying?" he asked. Naomi sat beside him, the edge of the bed familiar beneath her hands. "Yes," she said, "we're staying." "And you won't send us back?" His voice wavered, despite his effort to keep it steady. Naomi met his eyes, her own reflecting years of unspoken pain and unyielding resolve. "I didn't come this far to lose you," she said quietly. "Not now, not ever." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the words, letting them settle where fear had lived. As Naomi turned off the light and closed the door, she leaned briefly against the wall, her eyes closed, her breath shaky. The house was still fragile, the peace easily broken, but something real was taking root inside its walls. Something the town could not see yet. Something it would not understand until the distance between assumption and truth became impossible to ignore. Behind the closed door, a family was forming, not through ease or acceptance, but through persistence, patience, and a love that refused to retreat. The town had expected something to happen. It always did when a story arrived so neatly wrapped in suspicion. People waited for raised voices, for police lights in the evening, for a scandal that would confirm what they already believed. They watched Naomi Carter's small house with the quiet patience of certainty, confident that order would soon reassert itself and the unfamiliar would be corrected. When nothing happened, the waiting itself became uncomfortable. Weeks passed. The children continued to walk to school with Naomi each morning. Daniel's shoulders, once rigid as boards, lowered just a fraction. Lily stopped clinging to Naomi's coat at the school gate, though she still glanced back before stepping inside. Marcus waved at passing cars with solemn seriousness, as if practicing how to be seen without fear. The town noticed these things without admitting it. The first official disruption came on a Tuesday afternoon, carried not by gossip but by a government sedan that parked in front of Naomi's house. It was beige, unremarkable, the kind of car designed to disappear. It did not. Neighbors paused mid-task. Curtains shifted. Someone across the street leaned a little too long against a mailbox, pretending to check their phone. A woman down the block made a call she would later describe as coincidence. The social worker introduced herself as Miss Randall. She was polite, efficient, and practiced in the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to assume anything too quickly. Naomi welcomed her inside without hesitation. She had known this visit would come. It always did. Miss Randall looked around slowly, her gaze lingering on details rather than surfaces. She noticed the children's shoes by the door, the way they were lined up, worn but clean. She noticed the schedule pinned to the refrigerator, handwritten, the same routine every day. She noticed the smell of food still lingering faintly in the air. She asked questions. Naomi answered them. The children were spoken to gently, one at a time. Daniel answered with measured caution, choosing each word as if it mattered greatly. Lily whispered, her eyes darting to Naomi for reassurance. Marcus climbed into Naomi's lap and refused to move. His small fingers knotted into her sleeve. Miss Randall took notes. She nodded. She checked documents Naomi had already organized, stacked neatly in a thick folder that bore the wear of long handling. She did not rush. Outside, the town waited. When Miss Randall left without incident, without raised voices or obvious concern, the waiting turned into irritation. The absence of drama felt like a personal inconvenience. Conversations resumed with a sharper edge, frustration creeping into the familiar tones. If everything was fine, then why did it feel wrong? That question followed Naomi into the school office a few days later. The secretary smiled again, just as carefully as before, but this time there was a new undercurrent to it, something tight and dissatisfied. Naomi handed over a form, and the secretary paused longer than necessary before filing it. "I heard someone came by your house," she said lightly, as though discussing the weather. "Yes," Naomi replied. She did not offer more. "Well," the woman continued, lowering her voice, "it's good they're keeping an eye on things." Naomi met her gaze evenly. "They are," she said. The conversation ended there, unfinished and heavy. It was the children's teacher, Eleanor Hayes, who felt the first real shift. She had been teaching in this town for over 20 years. She knew the patterns of children better than most adults knew themselves. She noticed that Daniel stopped flinching when someone spoke behind him. She noticed Lily raising her hand in class, tentative but proud. She noticed Marcus, brought in occasionally for visits, laughing freely in the hallway. These were not the changes of children living in uncertainty. One afternoon, Eleanor asked Daniel to stay after class. He stiffened instantly, old habits snapping back into place, but he stayed. She spoke to him gently, asked about his favorite subject, about what he liked to read. His answers were cautious but honest. When Naomi arrived to pick him up, Eleanor saw the way Daniel relaxed when he spotted her, the way his body leaned unconsciously toward her. It was subtle. It was unmistakable. Later that week, Eleanor crossed paths with Naomi in the hallway. She hesitated, then spoke. "They're doing well," she said, "better than I expected." Naomi smiled faintly. "They've been through a lot." Eleanor studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It shows," she said, "and so does the care." That night, Naomi stayed up later than usual. The children slept soundly, the house unusually quiet. She spread her papers across the kitchen table again, but this time she did not read them. She simply looked at them, the stamps and signatures blurring together as exhaustion pressed down on her shoulders. A sound from the hallway made her look up. Daniel stood there, barefoot, his face pale in the dim light. "I couldn't sleep," he said. Naomi pushed her chair back and opened her arms. He crossed the room without hesitation and sat beside her, leaning into her side. They stayed that way for a long moment, neither speaking. "Are they going to take us away?" he asked finally. The question landed softly but carried the weight of everything that had come before. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second, steadying herself. "No," she said. "No one has taken you anywhere." He studied her face, searching for cracks. "People keep asking things," he said. At school? I know, Naomi replied. People ask when they don't understand. Do they understand now? He asked. Naomi shook her head slowly. Not yet. Daniel nodded, accepting the answer with the solemnity of someone used to waiting. He rested his head against her shoulder, his breathing evening out as sleep finally claimed him. The next day, Eleanor noticed something else. Naomi arrived to pick up Lily with a thick folder tucked under her arm, worn at the edges. When she set it down on a chair, a few papers slipped free. Eleanor glanced down instinctively and caught sight of unfamiliar seals, names of agencies from states far from their own. Texas, Ohio, Michigan. Her brow furrowed. She did not say anything then, but the image stayed with her, a quiet contradiction to the town's tidy assumptions. That night, Eleanor lay awake longer than usual, thinking about the way Naomi's life seemed to stretch far beyond the boundaries of their small town, beyond the simple narrative people preferred. The town continued to talk, but its confidence wavered. The stories grew less uniform, less certain. Some people began to lower their voices, others to change the subject altogether when Naomi passed. A few offered smiles that were not entirely forced. Not everyone softened. An anonymous call came into the school district questioning Naomi's fitness as a guardian. Another reached the local office of social services, thinly veiled as concern. Each time the response was the same. No action required. No cause found. The absence of confirmation began to erode the town's certainty. Suspicion thrived on reinforcement, and without it, the edges of the story dulled. Naomi felt the pressure shift, subtle but unmistakable. It did not disappear, it changed shape. People watched more quietly now, their judgment no less present but less bold. She sensed questions forming behind eyes that no longer met hers directly. At home, the children slept more peacefully. Laughter came more easily. The house felt warmer, fuller, as though it were finally accepting its purpose. Still, Naomi knew better than to believe the danger had passed. The truth she carried was not small. It did not fit neatly into the town's expectations, and she understood, with a clarity born of experience, that when it finally emerged, it would not arrive gently. It would split the story the town had written in two, leaving no one untouched by what lay beneath. For now, she waited, holding her family together behind closed doors, aware that the first crack had appeared and that the version of events the town clung to was already beginning to fracture. The questions that hovered around Naomi Carter did not begin in this town, though this was where they now took shape. They had followed her for years, changing their language but never their meaning, asking why she moved the way she did through the world, why she carried herself with such quiet vigilance, why her love seemed both fierce and restrained, as if held back by memory. Long before she returned to this place with 3 children at her side, Naomi had learned what it meant to be seen and misunderstood. She had grown up here, in this same town that now watched her from behind curtains and polite smiles. As a girl, she had walked these streets with quicker steps and lighter shoulders, believing that distance could protect her from the weight of other people's expectations. She was different even then, not because of anything she did, but because difference was something the town recognized instinctively. It cataloged it, discussed it, defined it before it had a chance to speak for itself. Naomi had learned early how to stay quiet, how to excel without drawing too much attention, how to keep her hopes folded neatly inside herself. She was good in school, helpful at home, careful in ways that were praised publicly but rarely rewarded privately. She learned that approval here came with conditions, and that belonging was something offered selectively. Her older sister, Rebecca, had never learned that lesson. Rebecca was everything Naomi was not. Where Naomi was reserved, Rebecca was radiant. Where Naomi moved cautiously, Rebecca moved as though the world owed her something and might deliver it at any moment. She was light-skinned, striking, magnetic in a way that bent rooms toward her. People noticed Rebecca not because they meant to, but because she demanded to be noticed simply by existing. As girls, they had shared a room at the back of their mother's small house. Naomi remembered lying awake at night listening to Rebecca whisper her dreams into the darkness. She would leave this town, Rebecca said. She would find something bigger, brighter, something that fit her better than this quiet place ever could. Naomi listened and believed her, even as she sensed the danger in dreams that burned too hot. Their mother tried to hold them both together, but she was tired, worn down by long hours and quiet disappointments. When she died, the house grew emptier in a way that could not be repaired. Naomi stayed because she did not know how to leave yet. Rebecca left because she could not stay. Years passed. Naomi built a life carefully, piece by piece. She worked, saved, planned. Rebecca drifted. She called sometimes, her voice bright and breathless, full of stories that did not quite add up. New cities, new men, new beginnings that always seemed to collapse just as quickly as they formed. The first child came quietly, almost accidentally. Rebecca arrived on Naomi's doorstep one afternoon with a baby in her arms, and exhaustion written into her face in a way Naomi had never seen before. She stayed for 3 weeks, sleeping late, crying in the bathroom when she thought Naomi could not hear her. Naomi helped without asking questions, rocking the baby, washing bottles, doing what she always did when someone she loved was falling apart. When Rebecca left, the baby left with her. The second child came 2 years later, born in another state, to another man. By then, Rebecca's voice on the phone had begun to change. It carried sharp edges, sudden drops into silence. Naomi recognized the signs even before she wanted to admit them. Addiction had found her sister, wrapped itself around her brightness, and begun to hollow it out. Naomi begged her to come back, to stay, to let her help. Rebecca refused. Pride tangled with fear, and both won. The third child came after Naomi had already stopped counting the number of times she had asked herself what she should have done differently. By then, the calls grew rarer. The stories became fragmented. Rebecca disappeared for months at a time, reappearing only to vanish again. Naomi sent money when she could. She kept addresses, scraps of information, anything that might lead her back if the silence grew too long. Then the silence became permanent. The call came from a hospital in a city Naomi had never visited. Rebecca was gone. An overdose. The words landed heavily, without drama, without the release of grief Naomi had expected. Instead, there was a numbness that spread slowly, filling every space inside her. In the days that followed, Naomi learned how easily people disappeared into systems not built to remember them. There were records, yes, but they were scattered, incomplete. Each agency knew only a fragment of Rebecca's life, never the whole. And the children, Naomi discovered, had been separated long before Rebecca died, placed in care, moved between homes, sent to different states based on availability rather than connection. The truth arrived not as a single revelation, but as a series of confirmations that cut deeper each time. Naomi spent nights on the phone, days traveling when she could afford to, listening to voices that spoke of policy and procedure as though they were laws of nature rather than choices made by people. She asked if the children were together. They were not. She asked if they could be reunited. It would be difficult. She asked if she could take them. The silence on the other end of the line was long enough to feel like judgment. Naomi did not give up. She gathered documents. She submitted forms. She underwent background checks, interviews, evaluations. She proved what should not have needed proof, that she was capable, that she was stable, that she was family. At every step, she was offered compromises. One child, they suggested. The youngest would be easiest, or perhaps the oldest, since he remembered her sister. Taking all three would be complicated, they warned. Unlikely, risky. Naomi listened. She thanked them. Then she refused. She could not choose between them. She would not. Rebecca's children had already been divided by circumstance, by neglect, by systems that valued efficiency over bonds. Naomi would not become another person who decided one was worth more than the others. The process took years. Years of waiting, of appeals, of temporary placements that ended too soon. Years of exhaustion that pressed against Naomi's resolve until it felt thin as glass. She sold what she could. She moved where she had to. She took work wherever it was offered. She slept in cheap motels and borrowed rooms, carrying a single suitcase and a growing file of paperwork that documented every step of her pursuit. There were moments when she nearly stopped. Moments when the weight of what she was trying to do felt impossible. In those moments, she thought of Rebecca's voice as it had been before everything went wrong. She thought of the promise she had made to herself, whispered into the dark years ago, that if she ever found those children, she would not let them disappear again. When the final approval came, it did not feel triumphant. It felt fragile, temporary. Naomi knew better than to celebrate too early. She brought the children together one by one, carefully, lowly. The first meeting was awkward, painful, filled with mistrust and confusion. They did not recognize one another as siblings. They barely recognized Naomi. But she stayed. She stayed through the anger, through the fear, through the long silences that followed questions no one yet knew how to ask. When she finally brought them back to the town she had once fled, it was not because she believed it would welcome them. It was because she needed roots. Because this was the only place she still owned a piece of. Because starting over somewhere entirely new felt like asking too much of children who had already lost so much. The town saw only the surface of her return. It did not see the years behind it. It did not see the roads she had traveled or the nights she had spent staring at ceilings in unfamiliar rooms, wondering how much more she could endure. As Naomi stood in her kitchen one night, the house quiet around her, she touched the edge of the old folder resting on the table. Inside it lived the past she had carried across states and systems, across grief and doubt. It was not a past she wanted to explain, but it was one she would not deny. The town was close now to the truth, though it did not yet know it. The cracks in its story were widening, and Naomi could feel the weight of what was coming. She had not returned to be forgiven. She had returned because her children needed a home. And this time, she was not running. The truth did not arrive in the town as a confession or a public announcement. It came the way truth often does, quietly, through paperwork and procedural language, through people whose jobs required accuracy rather than opinion. By the time it reached the streets and kitchens and whispered conversations of the town, it had already existed for years, heavy and undeniable, waiting only to be recognized. It began with a follow-up visit. Miss Randall returned on a gray morning, her presence less remarkable this time, though no less noticed. Naomi welcomed her inside with the same calm she had shown before. The children were at school, the house unusually still, as if holding its breath. Miss Randall set her folder on the kitchen table, thicker now, its edges worn, and asked Naomi if she had time to talk. Naomi nodded. She had always known this conversation would come. They spoke for a long time, about procedures, about timelines, about the extraordinary length of the case and the unusual circumstances surrounding it. Miss Randall did not ask questions meant to accuse. She asked questions meant to confirm what the documents already showed. Naomi answered them all, her voice steady, her hands folded loosely in her lap. At one point, Miss Randall paused, looking down at the papers spread before her. "Most people don't do this," she said quietly. "They stop." Naomi met her gaze. "I couldn't." It was not an explanation. It was a fact. When Miss Randall left, she did so with a different expression than she had worn before. Not suspicion, not neutrality. Something closer to respect, though she did not name it. That afternoon, Eleanor Hayes received a call. She listened carefully, her posture stiffening as the words took shape in her mind. She had suspected there was more to Naomi's story, but the truth, when spoken plainly, unsettled her far more than any rumor had. She asked a few clarifying questions, thanked the caller, and sat in silence for a long time after the line went dead. The children were not foster placements. They were not part of a system Naomi had stepped into on a whim or for benefit. They were family. The realization rippled outward slowly as Eleanor shared the information with the principal, who shared it with the district office, who confirmed it through official channels. Each person who learned the truth felt the same initial resistance, the instinctive refusal to adjust a story that had already taken root. It did not fit what they had decided. It did not align with the assumptions they had found so comfortable. But facts, once established, did not bend easily. The town learned in fragments. Someone overheard a conversation in the school office. Someone else saw a document stamped with Naomi's name and the word guardian replaced by aunt. A clerk at the county office spoke too freely to a neighbor who spoke to someone else. The story shifted, awkwardly at first, its edges jagged and incomplete. They are her sister's children. She searched for them for years. They were separated, different states. She took all three. Each new detail landed heavily, rearranging the familiar narrative into something unrecognizable. In the grocery store, the cashier who had once leaned in to whisper now fell silent when Naomi approached. At the gas station, the man who had watched her hands too closely stared at the counter instead. People struggled to reconcile the woman they had judged with the story emerging around her, a story that did not ask for approval and did not soften itself to be easier to accept. For Naomi, the change was palpable, though she did not acknowledge it openly. She felt it in the way conversations stopped, not with curiosity but with discomfort. She felt it in the looks that no longer measured her, but avoided her altogether. Shame, she realized, was louder than suspicion when it finally arrived. At home, the children sensed something shifting, though they could not name it. Daniel came home from school one afternoon unusually quiet, his brows drawn together in thought. He dropped his backpack by the door and followed Naomi into the kitchen, watching her as she moved. "They were talking," he said finally. Naomi turned, her heart tightening. "Who?" "Some kids. Their parents, too." He hesitated. "They said your family." The word hung between them. Naomi set the knife down slowly and met his gaze. "Yes," she said. "I am." Daniel studied her face, searching for something. You didn't tell us." Naomi nodded. "I know. Why?" She took a breath, steadying herself. "Because I didn't want that to be the reason you stayed," she said. "I wanted you to stay because you felt safe, because you wanted to, not because of a label." He absorbed this in silence, his young face reflecting a complexity far beyond his years. Finally, he nodded once. "Okay," he said, though the word carried far more weight than its simplicity suggested. Lily reacted differently. When she learned, she cried, her small body folding in on itself as confusion and relief tangled together. Naomi held her, rocking gently, letting the tears come. "Does that mean we belong together?" Lily asked, her voice muffled against Naomi's shoulder. Naomi pressed her cheek to Lily's hair. "Yes," she said softly. "It means you always did." Marcus, too young to understand the words, sensed the emotion in the house and clung to Naomi more tightly than usual, his presence grounding her in the present. As the truth spread, the town's response fractured. Some people withdrew, embarrassed by their earlier certainty. Others attempted quiet acts of restitution, leaving bags of groceries on Naomi's porch, offering rides, speaking in careful tones that bordered on apology without ever forming the word itself. A few resisted entirely, clinging to resentment as if it were the only thing left to them. Changing their minds, they seemed to believe, would mean admitting they had been wrong. One evening, Naomi found a note tucked into her mailbox. The handwriting was unsteady, the message brief. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. No name, no explanation, just the words." Naomi held the paper for a long moment, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where she kept important things. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vindicated. Mostly, she felt tired. The town, too, grew quiet in a new way. Not the easy quiet of routine, but the uneasy quiet of reckoning. People replayed their own words in their minds, hearing them now through a different lens. They remembered the looks they had given, the questions they had asked, the assumptions they had made without hesitation. Eleanor Hayes came to Naomi's house one evening just as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in soft gold. She stood on the porch for a moment before knocking, her expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "I wanted to say something," she said when Naomi opened the door. Naomi stepped aside, letting her in. "I should have asked sooner," Eleanor continued, her voice steady but subdued. "I should have trusted what I saw instead of what I heard." Naomi listened, her face calm. "You didn't know," she said. Eleanor shook her head. "That doesn't excuse everything." "No," Naomi agreed, "but it explains it." They sat in the living room, the house warm around them, the children's laughter drifting in from the back room. Eleanor looked at Naomi with something like awe. "I don't know how you did it," she said. Naomi's gaze drifted toward the doorway, where she could hear Daniel explaining a game to Lily, his voice animated in a way it had not been before. "I didn't have another choice," she replied. The truth, once fully revealed, did not bring immediate harmony. It brought discomfort, self-examination, and a silence thick with unspoken regret. The town did not erupt into tears or apologies. It did something harder. It stopped talking. And in that stillness, Naomi understood that the story was no longer hers to carry alone. The town would have to sit with what it had done, with what it had believed, and decide what kind of place it wanted to be now that the version it had written had been irrevocably undone. The hardest truth was not who the children were to Naomi. It was who the town had been to her, and who it would have to become next. The town did not erupt when the truth became unavoidable. There were no public meetings, no speeches delivered from church steps, no collective apologies spoken aloud. Instead, something quieter and far more unsettling took place. The town fell silent. It was not the comfortable silence of early mornings or snowfall. It was the silence that follows a realization too heavy to be dismissed, the kind that forces people to hear their own thoughts whether they want to or not. Conversations that once flowed easily now stumbled and stopped. Familiar jokes felt misplaced. Even routine greetings carried an awkward pause, as if everyone were waiting for someone else to speak first. Naomi noticed the change immediately. She noticed it in the grocery store, where the cashier who had once leaned forward to whisper now rang up her items without a word, her eyes fixed on the register screen. She noticed it at the gas station, where the man who used to watch her too closely now fumbled with the receipt and avoided her gaze entirely. She noticed it in the way people crossed the street sooner, not to avoid her, but to give her space they had never thought to offer before. Shame had entered the town quietly, and it did not know what to do with itself. At school, the change was just as palpable. Parents who had once clustered together now stood apart, their conversations subdued. Some children repeated fragments they had overheard at home, speaking in lowered voices, unsure of the meaning but aware of the weight. Teachers corrected them gently, firmly, shutting down speculation where it surfaced. Daniel felt the shift before he understood it. He came home one afternoon thoughtful, his movements slower, his eyes distant. He set his backpack down carefully and sat at the kitchen table, watching Naomi as she prepared dinner. "They don't say things anymore," he said finally. Naomi glanced at him. "What things?" "About you. About us." He hesitated. "They look at me weird now. Not bad, just different." Naomi nodded slowly. "People are thinking," she said. Daniel frowned. "About what?" She chose her words carefully. "About what they believed before," she said, "and what it means now." He considered this, his young face serious. "Is that good or bad?" Naomi smiled faintly. "It's necessary." Lily experienced the silence differently. She noticed the small kindnesses that followed in its wake. A classmate invited her to sit together at lunch. A mother complimented her drawing and meant it. A neighbor waved not out of obligation but recognition. Lily did not understand why these things were new, only that they made her feel lighter. Marcus, oblivious to the larger shift, sensed only that the world felt calmer, fewer tense voices, fewer sharp movements. He laughed more easily now, toddling through the house with unburdened curiosity, his joy uncomplicated by memory. For Naomi, the silence was both a relief and a test. She did not seek apologies. She did not expect them. What she felt instead was the strange weight of being seen clearly at last, of having the full truth of her life laid bare in a place that had once only glimpsed fragments. It was not comfortable. Visibility rarely was. The first direct acknowledgement came not in words, but in action. One morning, Naomi opened her door to find a box on the porch. Inside were children's clothes, folded neatly, with the tags still attached. There was no note. Later that week, someone left a bag of groceries. Another day, a pair of gently used books appeared, tucked against the doorframe. Naomi accepted these offerings quietly, without comment. She understood them for what they were. Attempts at repair, clumsy but sincere. Not everyone participated. There were still a few who resisted the truth, who clung to their earlier judgments as a form of self-protection. For them, admitting they had been wrong felt more dangerous than remaining cruel. They watched Naomi with narrowed eyes, muttering to one another in corners, framing their bitterness as skepticism. One of them made another call. The complaint was anonymous, as such things often were. It questioned Naomi's fitness as a guardian, raised vague concerns about the children's well-being, suggested that sentiment had clouded judgment. The call moved through the proper channels, triggering yet another review. When Naomi received notice of the investigation, she did not react outwardly. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table beside her documents. Her hands were steady, but her chest tightened with a familiar ache. She had known this, too, was possible. This time, however, she was not alone. Eleanor Hayes learned of the complaint through the school district and felt a sharp anger she had not expected. She thought of Daniel's careful diligence, of Lily's growing confidence, of Marcus's laughter echoing through the hallway. She thought of the nights she herself had spent reconsidering her silence, her complicity. She wrote a statement, not as a teacher fulfilling a requirement, but as a witness. Others followed. The school counselor submitted observations. A pediatric nurse documented the children's progress. Miss Randall added her own report, thorough and unequivocal. Even a neighbor, one of the quiet ones who had watched without speaking, came forward to say what she had seen. Consistency, care, stability. The investigation concluded quickly. When Naomi received the final notice confirming that no further action would be taken, she allowed herself a long, silent breath. She folded the letter and placed it in the folder that had become a record not only of struggle, but of survival. The town heard about the failed complaint soon enough. This time the response was different. People spoke of it with discomfort, shaking their heads, unwilling to defend the action. Someone muttered that it had gone too far. Someone else said quietly that some things could not be undone, once said aloud. Naomi did not ask who had made the call. She did not want to know. Carrying that knowledge felt unnecessary, even harmful. She had learned that healing did not come from confronting every wound directly. The closest thing to an apology came one evening as Naomi stood in the front yard watching the children play. A woman approached slowly, her posture hesitant. "I used to talk," the woman said abruptly, her voice trembling. "I shouldn't have. I didn't know." Naomi looked at her, really looked, and saw fear rather than malice. "No," she said gently. "You didn't." The woman swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, anyway." Naomi nodded. "Thank you." That was all. The town did not transform overnight. There were no grand gestures, no declarations of newfound understanding. What changed instead were the small things. Doors held open a moment longer. Invitations extended cautiously. Eyes met instead of sliding away. The silence softened. One afternoon, Naomi walked down the same main street where she had first arrived weeks earlier. This time, the street did not pause to watch her pass. People nodded. A man tipped his hat. A woman smiled and meant it. The town had not become perfect, but it had become quieter in a way that allowed space for reflection. At home that evening, Naomi sat at the kitchen table as the children slept. The house felt full now, settled, no longer bracing itself against intrusion. She thought of the story the town had written and rewritten, of how easily it had judged and how slowly it had learned. She did not feel victorious. What she felt was a calm resolve. She had not returned to teach the town a lesson. She had returned to keep a promise. Everything else had been incidental. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was the sound of a community standing still long enough to realize what it had done and what it might still do better. And for the first time since Naomi had come back, the town allowed itself to listen. Time did not heal everything at once, but it began to move differently after the town fell silent. The days stopped feeling like trials to be endured and started to resemble something closer to living. The change was subtle, almost invisible if one did not know what to look for, but Naomi felt it in her body first. She woke without the familiar knot of anticipation in her chest. She moved through her mornings without bracing herself for the next question, the next look, the next challenge. The house responded as well. It no longer seemed to hold its breath when the door opened or a car passed outside. The floors creaked as they always had, but the sound felt companionable now, like an old voice clear in its throat. The furnace hummed steadily. Light filled the rooms in a way that made them feel larger than they were. The house, once a shelter, had begun to settle into its role as something more permanent. The children changed with it. Daniel changed first, though the shift was so gradual it might have gone unnoticed by anyone who did not watch him closely. The vigilance that had once defined him loosened its grip. He no longer positioned himself between Naomi and the world without realizing it. He forgot to check the locks at night. He laughed, not often at first, but freely when it came, his laughter sharp and surprised, as if he were discovering the sound for the first time. At school, his teacher noticed that his work improved, not because he tried harder, but because he no longer tried to control everything. He raised his hand more often. He argued gently with classmates instead of withdrawing. When he asked Naomi if he could join the soccer team, it was not framed as a test of whether she would say yes. It was simply a question, asked with expectation rather than fear. Naomi stood on the sidelines at his first practice, watching him run awkwardly across the field, his movements unpolished but eager. She felt a tightness in her throat she did not try to suppress. This, she realized, was what safety looked like. Not the absence of danger, but the freedom to be clumsy, to fail, to try again without catastrophe. Lily blossomed more quietly. She began to talk more at home, her voice gaining strength and color. She brought home stories from school, small dramas and triumphs that mattered intensely to her. She stopped asking the same questions over and over, stopped needing constant reassurance that Naomi would still be there when she returned. Instead, she assumed it, as children should. One afternoon, Lily brought a friend home without asking first. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with both excitement and uncertainty, waiting for Naomi's reaction. Naomi smiled and invited them in without hesitation. Lily watched her carefully, then beamed, pride flooding her face. Later, as the girls played in the living room, Lily leaned close to Naomi and whispered, "This is my house," with a certainty that felt like a gift. Marcus grew in leaps and bounds, his progress marked less by milestones than by ease. He slept through the night consistently now, his dreams no longer haunted by sudden terror. He explored the world with fearless curiosity, toddling from room to room, confident that Naomi would be there when he turned around. His laughter filled the house, unrestrained and contagious. Naomi found herself laughing more often, too, startled sometimes by how natural it felt. The town adjusted slowly, unevenly, as towns do. Some people made a conscious effort to bridge the distance they had once enforced. Invitations came, tentative but sincere. A neighbor asked if Lily would like to join a birthday party. Another offered to carpool Daniel to practice. Naomi accepted when she could, declined when she needed to, learning to trust her instincts without apology. Not everyone changed. There were still glances that lingered too long, silences that carried old judgments. Naomi did not expect perfection. She had learned that expecting too much from people often led to disappointment. What mattered was that the children were no longer surrounded by hostility, that the sharp edges had been dulled enough to make room for growth. The final test came unexpectedly, as such things often do. A man appeared at the edge of Naomi's life one afternoon, carrying with him a name from the past and a claim he believed he had the right to make. He was the biological father of one of the children, a figure who had existed only as a line in a file until now. He had learned of the children's whereabouts through the same systems Naomi had once navigated with such difficulty. He did not arrive with anger or drama. He arrived with uncertainty and entitlement tangled together, convinced that biology alone granted him a place in a story he had never tried to tell before. The meeting took place in a neutral office, walls painted a careful beige, the air heavy with procedural calm. Naomi sat across from him, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She listened as he spoke of rights and regrets, of missed chances reframed as misunderstandings. She did not interrupt. When it was her turn to speak, she did not raise her voice. She did not appeal to sentiment. She spoke instead of facts, of years spent searching, of nights slept in unfamiliar places, of children who had learned to survive by expecting nothing. The officials listened. The man listened too, though his expression hardened as the weight of her words settled in. In the end, the decision was clear. Naomi's guardianship remained intact. The man was offered limited, supervised contact if the child wished it in the future. He left with his disappointment contained, his claim reduced to what it had always been, a possibility, not a certainty. When Naomi returned home that evening, the house greeted her with the soft chaos of ordinary life. Daniel was sprawled on the floor with his homework. Lily was coloring at the table. Marcus ran toward her with unsteady enthusiasm, arms outstretched. Naomi knelt to catch him, burying her face in his hair, breathing him in. The tension she had carried all day dissolved in that simple act. Later, after the children were asleep, Naomi sat alone in the living room, the lights dimmed, the quiet deep and gentle. She thought of the path that had brought her here, of the version of herself who had once believed running was the only option. She thought of Rebecca, of the promise she had made in the dark, of the cost of keeping it. The house felt full now, not crowded but complete. She walked down the hallway, pausing at each doorway. Daniel slept sprawled across his bed, his face relaxed in a way that still surprised her. Lily slept curled around a stuffed animal, her breathing slow and even. Marcus lay on his back, one hand flung above his head, utterly at peace. Naomi stood there for a long moment, her heart heavy with gratitude and grief intertwined. She knew the world would not always be kind. She knew challenges would come, new forms of doubt and difficulty waiting beyond the horizon. But she also knew something else now. She was no longer alone against it. She returned to the living room and sat down, the silence wrapping around her like a familiar blanket. Outside, the town lay quiet, lights glowing softly in windows, lives unfolding in their ordinary ways. It was not a perfect place. It never would be. But it was no longer hostile ground. It was home. As Naomi turned off the lamp and prepared for sleep, she whispered into the darkness, not to the town, not to the past, but to the present she had fought so hard to build. "I found you," she said softly, "and I'm not letting go." In the rooms beyond, 3 children slept, unaware of the full weight of those words, but held securely within them. And in that quiet house at the edge of town, a family, forged through endurance and choice, rested at last. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Watch more videos on the channel. Every story changes how you see the world. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it.